Welcome back to our study through the book of Isaiah. This is brought to you by the Port Huron Church of Christ at 756 17th Street in Port Huron. And I just want to welcome you back to our study and let you know that you are welcome to anything and everything going on at the church. We'd love to hear from you, love to visit with you, and just pray that this video finds you well. So we're going to quickly recap what we discussed in our previous video. This is video number 14. So we left off with video 13, understanding that the only thing that God really doesn't have much patience with is insulting Him. You do not want to ridicule God. He doesn't tolerate it. He just, there will come a day when you have to answer for what you say, especially concerning God. And we talked about the name of Jesus. That is the only name under heaven by which we can be saved, and strangely enough, it is also the only name of the only deity that we ever hear about being used as a cuss word. So that's kind of where we left off with video number 13 last week. So picking up here in chapter 14, we're going to be looking at chapter 37 of the book of Isaiah. And what had happened here was that the king of Assyria, his name is Sennacherib, he had sent his field commander to speak to leaders of Judah, of the southern tribe of Judah. And now the king himself wasn't there, but the Secretary of State and so on like that, they were there. And so this is where the field commander from Assyria is talking to them in the hearing of the other men of Judah sitting on the walls. And he was insulting God and trying to get them to lose heart and basically saying, the king of Assyria has conquered all these other nations and their gods didn't do anything to help them. So in chapter 37, this report of what had happened is sent to King Hezekiah of Judah. And so let's pick up with Isaiah chapter 37, beginning at verse 1. When King Hezekiah heard this, and this was the report that the field commander had insulted God and said, you might as well give up now. When King Hezekiah heard this, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and went into the temple of the Lord. Now, right out of the gate here, he's going into the temple of the Lord, and he's going to do this in the presence of the people. So there's a lot of symbolism here, which is common in the Old Testament practice of Judaism. When he tears his clothes, it's a sign of blasphemy, and he is upset. And the putting on of sackcloth. The sackcloth was like a very dark brown or a black, almost like a burlap kind of clothing. It was very itchy, very uncomfortable, very hot. And it was something that you wore to show that you were in mourning, that you were dealing with tragedy. So this was the tearing of the clothes, the sackcloth, and he's also going into the temple of God in the presence of all the people. And what this shows is it's showing the people that the time for plotting military campaigns or strategic attacks using the geography or any kind of diplomatic solution, all of these things are done. There's no other choice but to trust God and God alone. So the fact that the king is going into the temple in the presence, the witnessing of all the people, that's what this is saying. We have no other choice but to trust God and God alone. Hezekiah will also send messengers. In verses 2 and 3, he sends messengers to the prophet Isaiah. And he basically asks the messengers for two things. He says, tell Isaiah what happened, that maybe God will fight or remedy or rebuke this Assyrian field commander, and also asks Isaiah to pray for the remnant. A remnant is just a small contingency of survivors. And so this theme of a remnant of people has also been going, an ongoing theme here within the book of Isaiah. So King Hezekiah is asking Isaiah, make sure God knows about this, and please pray for the survivors that are still here. So that's what's happening there. When we pick up with verse 5, Isaiah has a response for the king. And he says, let the king know that God will deal with Assyria's blasphemies. And within this time frame, it's not just the field commander shooting off his mouth, even though he is speaking on behalf of the Assyrian king. But then the Assyrian king is going to be looking at another battle on another front, and so he sends a letter to Judah, King Hezekiah, and basically reiterates what the field commander said. So let's take a look at chapter 37. Let's start back up at verse 4. This was part of the message that Hezekiah had asked to tell Isaiah. It says, it may be that the Lord your God will hear the words of the field commander, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to ridicule the living God, and that he will rebuke him for the words the Lord your God has heard. Therefore pray for the remnant that still survives. Now here's verse 5, chapter 37, verse 5. When King Hezekiah's officials came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, tell your master, now this is the king of Judah, tell your master, this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid of what you heard. Those words with which the underling of the king of Assyria has blasphemed me. Listen, when he hears a particular report, I will make him want to return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword. This is verse 8. And sure enough, when the field commander heard that the king of Assyria had left Lachish, he withdrew and found the king fighting against Libnah. Verse 9. Now Sennacherib, this is the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, received a report that Turkana, I think that's it, the king of Cush was marching out to fight against him. When he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah with this word. So again, you've got the king of Assyria is going to have to go battle the king of Cush on a different front away from Judah. But when the field commander of Assyria hears this, he goes to join his king in this battle. And as this is going to go down, the king of Assyria is going to send a very similar message back to the king of Judah. And what he's really trying to do is he's trying to get the king of Judah, Hezekiah, to lose heart and just pretty much give up, even though the Assyrians have to go fight on this other battlefield. So that's what's taking place here. So now we are at verse 10. Say to Hezekiah, the king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says, quote, Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria, end quote. Surely you have heard what the king of Assyria has done to all the countries, destroying them completely, and will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my predecessors deliver them? And then he lists all these nations that he had conquered and their deities, and he's saying the same basic thing. He's saying, look, I conquered all these people, and their deities, their gods, didn't do anything, so don't think that your God will be any different. And of course the difference is that the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, has no idea that he is dealing with the true God, not just a piece of wood overlaid with gold. He is dealing with the living God, the God of Israel. So this is what's taking place. So you have Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, who is blaspheming and attacking God himself, just like his field commander did, and God isn't going to have it. Okay, so but that's what's taking place here. So we saw the field commander was first, and then Sennacherib himself did the same thing. And Hezekiah, the king of Judah, responded the way leaders should. First thing Hezekiah did was he asked people to pray. And he prayed himself. And God honored that. So let me just take a moment and chase this rabbit right here for a little bit. In our last video, in video 13, we saw that when the field commander was attacking the name of God, when he was trying to dishearten the Israelites, down in Judah, there were 3 areas that the people would have been tempted to succumb or surrender to Assyria. And we learned that those 3 areas were the same areas that we are tempted in when we are faced with opposition, especially when we know it's God's work. And those 3 areas, they were threatened with their very survival, they were threatened with their comfort, and they were threatened in regard to their faith. And we have the same battles to fight. So I'm not going to relive all of that, but just know that in our culture it looks a little differently. Our survival usually has to do with our job or our house or something like that. We don't have to worry a whole lot about our lives being put on the line because of our faith in Jesus Christ. They did. And they didn't even know who Jesus was yet. But just their faith in God was, their survival was hinging on that. And their faith went hand in hand in that. Their survival, their faith, and obviously their comfort. And Assyria tempted them with all 3. We are tempted in very similar fashion. But the way Hezekiah responded is the way that our leaders and we ourselves should respond. And you think, well, I'm not a leader. I'm not even on I'm not on the PTA. I'm not on a committee of any kind. But you're still a member of a household. And maybe you still are working. Maybe you're a student. Perhaps it's just among your circle of friends and family members. But every person has a decision to make. And when we are faced with temptation, it's a great idea to respond in the same way that Hezekiah did. He prayed, and he asked other people to pray. You can't go wrong doing that. Because Hezekiah does this, God honors that. He not only answers Hezekiah's prayer, but he goes way beyond what Hezekiah could have probably even imagined. Look at what happens. Chapter 37, verse 15 shows us the prayer. Okay? Hezekiah received the letter from the messenger and read it. So this was the letter that the king of Assyria said, why do you put your faith in your deity, your God? Nobody else's God, help them. So Hezekiah receives the letter, he reads it, and then he went up to the temple of the Lord, he spread it out before the Lord. Look at verse 15. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. Here's his prayer. Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherub, you alone are God, over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Give ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to all the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. So, obviously, he doesn't think that God doesn't know. He's asking God to do something about this. He goes on to bear his heart to the Lord. This is verse 18. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste to all these people and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them. For they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord, our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, Lord, are the only God. Did you notice that during Hezekiah's prayer, he didn't ask God to step in because Hezekiah wanted revenge, or because he was offended, or because Hezekiah felt that he was in the right and King Sennacherib was in the wrong? No. Hezekiah's reason for asking God to step in was because they insulted God. And he wants God to be glorified. He wants the nations, all the nations, to know that God is the real God. That should be our motivation as well. not our comfort, not our justification, not revenge. Nothing like that should be our motivation when we ask God to intervene. If we ask God to intervene for something, it should be for His glory. Moving on. Look at how God responds. In chapter 37, in verse 21, Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent a message to King Hezekiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Because you have prayed to me concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word the Lord has spoken against him. Virgin daughter Zion despises and mocks you. Daughter Jerusalem tosses her head as you flee. Who is it you have ridiculed and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel. I could keep going. This is all a lot of poetry about God being very poetic about the fact that God is, through Isaiah, telling Hezekiah, don't worry, because yes, the king of Assyria has offended God. And look at what God does more than just say what he's going to do. Skip down to chapter 37, verse 36. The angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were dead bodies everywhere. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. Did you catch that? God intervened in a way that doesn't always sit well with us as Americans. We are so independent. In fact, I really enjoyed Lamar's sermon this past Sunday that, sometimes we're too independent for our own good and we can become self-centered. But what happens here is that the leader of Assyria, the king and his field messenger, insult God. And God sends out an angel to kill 185,000 soldiers in a single night while they sleep. And we hear that and we think, wow, well, that's kind of harsh. These soldiers, they were probably just following orders, and wow, that doesn't seem very fair. That doesn't seem very nice of God. Here's the thing. People can suffer the consequences of their leaders. Why is that? Because the people choose to follow. I'm not saying rebel against every decision you don't agree with. What I am saying is that people normally do not rise above the level of their leadership. And if the leadership is ungodly, and people choose to follow their example and follow their leadership, then God really doesn't have a lot of sympathy because that was their decision. As Christians, here in 21st century America, anywhere in the free world, there's never going to be a leader that you agree with 100% on every issue, on every decision, or every aspect of their life. And even so that when you do not disagree, sure, you're still a citizen of that country and this individual was elected or what have you, but it doesn't mean that you have to engage in the same moral depravity that leader may engage in. Now, this is kind of gray area because, like I said, especially here, good luck finding leadership, especially on a national level, that doesn't have a skeleton in the closet somewhere. And it does make me sad. I'm not going to dive into politics here, but it seems like sometimes we don't have a great choice. All I can encourage you with is to say, for you and your house, choose to serve the Lord. Okay? Because sometimes people will suffer the consequences because of the actions of their leadership. The reverse is true as well. People can also suffer consequences if their leadership does nothing. And people can also enjoy the benefits of their leadership when they make the right choice. So it's a give and take, and that's just kind of the world we live in. But understand that God does not show favoritism. So if you're in leadership, make sure you're walking the walk. And if you're not, make sure that you know the difference between when to agree with the leader because they are your leader and when to take a stand and say no. Okay? Enough about that. So this is what God does. That's the other side of the coin. As far as Judah is concerned, the Assyrian problem has just been taken care of. 185,000 guys gone in a single evening. And what does the king do? He says, oh no, we're out of here. There's something for real about this place. We're gone. So he breaks camp and he leaves. And what it does is it shuts Sennacherib right up. We don't hear another peep from this guy concerning Israel or trying to get into Israel or conquer them or anything. It takes this guy down more than a peg, all right? It must have humbled him severely. Because what does he do when he gets home? He goes to church. Not a good one, but he goes to worship. Look at what happens. This is end of chapter 37, verse 38. We hear that all these guys die. He returns to Nineveh, which, by the way, was the capital city of Assyria. And, I just thought of something. If you have ever read the story of Jonah, and Jonah is told to go to the city of Nineveh and preach against it. And if you haven't read the story, I encourage you to do so. But long story short, he doesn't want to go. And he tries to get out of it. Why does Jonah not want to go to Nineveh? Because he knows that Nineveh is going to be the capital city of Assyria, who just a generation after him will end up will conquer northern Israel and try to conquer southern Judah. So that's why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. And he's on a different boat, and the storm comes up, and he ends up getting swallowed by the giant fish, and eventually, he gets puked up on shore, and then he does, when he thinks he's obeying God, and he just runs through town and says, oh, you better stop or God's going to kick you. And then he goes up on a hilltop and waits to see God destroy them, and I won't give away the ending for you. You'll have to read it. But that's why he didn't want to go to Nineveh, was because Nineveh would be the capital of Assyria, and he knew it. So, back to Isaiah. Chapter 37, verse 38. One day, when he was worshiping, this is the king of Assyria. One day while he was worshiping in the temple of his god, Nasroch, his sons, I'll try to say this, Adamelech and Sherezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped to the land of Arat. And Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king. So this king of Assyria, Sennacherib, the guy with all the mouth and, quite frankly, the military to back it up, he ends up getting killed in his church by his own sons, stabbed in the back, only to have a third son take the throne. Kind of like you can just feel the warmth of the father-son relationship there, can't you? God does not tolerate arrogance and insults against himself. So everybody got what was coming to them. All because little Judah, and their king Hezekiah, their prophet Isaiah, remained faithful to God. Moving on. In the last video, we also learned that God is against pride and arrogance regardless of who you are. And unfortunately, there's one more character here that's got one coming. As you get into chapter 38, it kind of backs up a little bit, and it says that Hezekiah fell ill, even to the point of death. In fact, Isaiah goes to Hezekiah and he says, "Here, God told me to tell you to get your house in order because you're going to die." And Hezekiah turns to God like he's supposed to, and he is bitter and he's upset and he's crying, and he asks God to remember his faithfulness. And so God says, "Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to heal you, and I'll give you another 15 years here." So Hezekiah is like, "Awesome, that's great." But then something happens, and Hezekiah also, even right after this, he succumbs to pride and arrogance as well. God gave him 15 years, and if you look at chapter 39, 38 is all of Hezekiah asking God to heal him. God does. In chapter 39, it says at that time, this is right after Hezekiah is healed, Marduk, Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon. So now we see Assyria's power in the world stage starting to wane because the main king is gone. And it was a shady situation. Murdered the king. His son takes over. But now there is a contingency from Babylon that's going to be sneaky and come visit Hezekiah. So this is from the king of Babylon. He sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he heard that about his illness and recovery. Verse 2, this is chapter 39, verse 2. Hezekiah received the envoys gladly and showed them what was in his storehouses: the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine olive oil, his entire armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all of his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show to them. Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah, and he said, "What did those men say, and where did they come from?" "Well, from a distant land," Hezekiah replied. "They came to me from Babylon." The prophet asked, "What did they see in your palace?" "They saw everything in my palace," Hezekiah said. "There's nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." This was King Hezekiah's pride. He was showing off. But here's the odd part. If you had somebody, let's say you had a neighbor that didn't like you and wanted what you have, would you show him everything that you have? And it's more than just being deceived. Hezekiah is bragging about his treasure and about their military and about all this kind of stuff. Now, even though Hezekiah was a good guy, this is the same guy that just had his life extended because he was helpless and he was going to die. This is the same guy that was completely helpless against Assyria, and God had to intervene miraculously to save them. And yet here he is bragging to Babylon, who is starting to come to world power, and they're starting to grow as an empire. They're even more brutal than the Assyrians, and so this was a prideful, big mistake by King Hezekiah. If you go down, verse 5, this is where we'll land tonight. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And of course, a eunuch was unable to have children. And look at, Hezekiah hears this, and basically Isaiah is telling him, because of your pride, Babylon is going to come and carry everybody away. They're going to take everything in your palace. They're even going to take your family members, and that's going to pretty much be the end of your family line. And you're done because of this. And look at Hezekiah's response in verse 8. He says, "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," Hezekiah replied, because he thought, well, at least there will be peace and security in my lifetime. Hezekiah was overall a good guy, but at the end, he became prideful and maybe forgot his roots. I don't know. And at the end, he was also selfish. He tells Isaiah, "Oh, okay, that's fine, because at least while I'm here, everything will be okay." So I want to leave you with some encouragement here, that be like early Hezekiah, not later Hezekiah, because Hezekiah did the right thing about turning to God, praying to God, asking people to pray, and his only concern was how God was viewed, and the glory of God, and the majesty of God, and God's plan. We don't have to worry about God's glory. He has plenty of that without us. But we are His children, and He is our Father. And because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, it should be that kind of close relationship. So we want to see our Father glorified and honored among all nations of the world, just like early Hezekiah wanted. And obviously that goes along with a warning. Because we are God's children, and because we do receive His love and His blessings, we don't ever want to become prideful, because God does not show favoritism when it comes to opposing the proud. So I pray this video has found you well, and I hope and pray that I just hope that this encourages you and just helps you in your walk with the Lord. So until next time, God bless.